Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am pleased to rise to move the following motion. Be it resolved that the Legislative Assembly recognize the results of the referendum held on October 18th of 2021, where 61.7% of voters supported removing Section 36(2) of the Constitution Act 1982, Parliament of the Government of Canada's commitment to the principle of making equalization payments, reaffirm the principle articulated by the Supreme Court of Canada in the 1998 reference accession of Quebec, that is, quotes, the constitutional rights of each participant in the Federation to initiate constitutional change, and that this right implies a reciprocal duty on the other participants to engage in discussions, to address any legitimate initiative, to change the constitutional order, unquote. C, to authorize an amendment to the Constitution of Canada to be made by proclamation issued by Her Excellency the Governor-General under the Great Seal of Canada in accordance with the schedule set forth below. And D, to direct the Government of Alberta to take all necessary steps to secure a fair deal for Alberta in the Canadian Federation, including the reform of federal transfer programs, the defence of provincial powers enumerated in the Constitution, and the right to pursue responsible development of natural resources. Included in this motion, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a schedule which is an amendment to the Constitution of Canada. The Constitution of Canada Act 1982 is amended by repealing subsection 36(2) thereof, and this amendment may be cited as the Constitution Amendment. There you are, Madam Deputy Speaker. So this is the motion pursuant to the referendum. Okay. Actually, this has already been moved, Madam Deputy Speaker, so I guess I don't need to table it. I'm rising to speak in favour of the motion, I should say. This is the motion that is pursuant to the referendum held on October the 18th, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the last general election, the United Conservative Party committed in its platform to hold a referendum on the principle of equalization in the Constitution in order to give Albertans an opportunity to express their deep sense of frustration in how the Federation operates, decades of unfairness, and to give Albertans an opportunity to say yes to a fair deal in the Federation. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, Albertans came to the polls 2 weeks ago to do so in enormous numbers, with 62% voting in favour of this proposition. I should point out, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in the Fair Deal panel review, which was mandated with assessing how Alberta could strengthen its place in the Federation, that they recommended precisely this question. Madam Deputy Speaker, Albertans, as I've always pointed out, are proud Canadians, and that is reflected by the fact we're the only legislature in the country to have every flag of every province and territory in our assembly. Alberta is home to more migrants from other parts of Canada than is any other province. In that sense, we are demographically, I believe, the most Canadian province. Later on this morning, we will gather in the rotunda of this place to mark Remembrance Day and to give thanks in silence for the sacrifices of Canadian soldiers who went to foreign battlefields to defend Canada, to defend our democratic values, to defend human dignity. And nothing binds us more deeply to Canada than those sacrifices and then those battles that we have fought together. And so let there be no doubt, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Albertans are proud Canadians. I believe we can say the proudest of Canadians, with one of the highest levels of participation in the military historically, and with such an enormous contribution to the prosperity of the Federation. Indeed, since, according to the research initially done by University of Calgary Professor Emeritus of Economics, Dr. Robert Mansell, Alberta has contributed net, Albertans have contributed net $630 billion more to the rest of Canada than we have received back from Ottawa in transfers and benefits since 1965. And in the past decade, we have contributed, despite COVID, we have contributed $200 billion net more to the rest of the Federation through our federal taxes. Now, these are not transfers between the Government of Alberta and the Government of Canada, but rather these constitute net fiscal transfers between Albertans as federal taxpayers and what comes back to this province in the form of federal benefits and transfers. $630 billion, $20 billion a year in recent years. And over those recent years, Madam Deputy Speaker, over those recent years, we have seen Alberta in a period of prolonged economic adversity. Beginning in roughly 2015, we saw our GDP collapse, our economy collapse from an output of $362 billion a year to as low as $320 billion a year. We saw a 20% decline in our economic output by the height of COVID. It was a 10% decline in our economic output prior to being hit by COVID. And in that context, we continued to contribute in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, we continued to contribute $20 billion a year more to the rest of the Federation than we got back in services and benefits. Now, at the same time, Madam Deputy Speaker, the province of Quebec saw its equalization transfers from the national government increase year after year after year to over $13 billion, even when it was a period of sustained economic growth. And so effectively, we had unemployed Albertans and underemployed Albertans through their federal taxes transferring funds to a province which had lower unemployment, which had a surplus while we had a massive deficit, which had dynamic growth while we had a sustained and deep recession. That one fact alone underscores the sense of unfairness in this province. But let me be clear. Albertans are generous. They are proud to have been able to share much of our prosperity with the rest of Canada when times have been good and bad here, but bad elsewhere. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we cannot abide, and what we will no longer abide through this motion, is a system where we are compelled to subsidize public services in other parts of Canada while our ability to generate the wealth that creates those transfers is constantly impaired and impeded by policies of the national government and indeed of some other provinces. So all of this has been happening in obviously, Madam or Mr. Speaker, there are deep historical roots of alienation that go back to the very beginning of the Federation, of the inclusion of Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular in the Federation in 1905, when these provinces alone were not granted initially ownership over our natural resources, when these provinces were granted fewer Senate seats than provinces in central and eastern Canada, when these provinces were treated under the national policy effectively as quasi-colonies of the national government. But Alberta governments fought decade after decade to strengthen our position, and gradually did so, most notably with the success of Premier Brownlee and his government in obtaining the National Resource Transfer Act, which established provincial ownership over natural resources. And thank goodness they did that, Mr. Speaker. But we saw that fundamental unfairness over the decades, most notably in 1981, with the imposition of the National Energy Program on this province, which had, as we all know, a devastating economic, social, and human impact. There are hundreds of thousands of Albertans who still have deep and bitter memories about that period, when the national government effectively came into our backyard, took over our property, told us how to run our affairs, and virtually confiscated, well, did effectively confiscate, tens of billions of dollars of value from our largest industry, pushing the real estate market here into a tailspin, throwing tens of thousands of people out of work, destroying thousands and thousands of businesses, leading to great human misery in this province. Albertans remember that. And that's why we fought constructively for this province, as Premier Lougheed did in securing Section 92A in the newly patriated Constitution Act of 1982, which was effectively a response to the National Energy Program by affirming exclusive provincial jurisdiction over the regulation of the production of natural resources, including specifically oil and gas. So a critical victory to reinforce the National Resource Transfer Act of 1932. And yet, despite having secured that clear exclusive provincial authority over the development of our resources, we have seen under the current federal government policy after policy, law after law, regulation after regulation, an effort to once again interfere in the development of our natural resources and injure our economy. The decision of Prime Minister Trudeau to veto arbitrarily the Northern Gateway pipeline project of Enbridge, even after it had received conditional approval from the National Energy Board, even after it had received approval of the federal Governor General and Council, even after it had gone through years of exhaustive review, Mr. Speaker, Justin Trudeau, with the support of the leader of Alberta's NDP, stepped in and killed a project that would have represented tens of billions of dollars of value and an incalculable number of future jobs for this province. At the same time, the same Prime Minister surrendered completely to a veto of the Keystone XL pipeline presidential permit application, which was signed by President Obama 48 hours after Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, in what was clearly a setup that stabbed Alberta in the back, Mr. Speaker. A project that would allow us to ship an additional 880,000 barrels a day, 840,000 barrels a day of Alberta energy to U.S. markets, killed by U.S. administration with, I believe, the de facto complicity of the current federal government. Then, federal regulations imposed on the National Energy Board resulted in that board applying a bizarre new test to Enbridge's Energy East proposed pipeline, which would have forced that company to take responsibility for upstream emissions associated with the production of energy shipped by that pipeline and downstream emissions of the consumers. We're basically people driving trucks and cars in New England. So Enbridge is being told they had to calculate, they had to take responsibility in the operation of their pipeline for truck drivers and people heating their homes in New York and Massachusetts as the end-line consumers, but also they had to take responsibility for emissions associated with the production of that energy. In other words, double and triple counting emissions for a pipeline which is virtually emissions neutral. And so, quite understandably, after having spent $1 billion in 7 years on the project, Enbridge threw up their hands and said, there is no feasible way that we could meet this ever-changing, bizarre federal regulatory standard. And so they abandoned their application at the National Energy Board, killing the dream, at least for this time, of Canadian energy independence, forcing Irving on the East Coast to continue to unload a supertanker of Saudi crude every week into the North American market, empowering OPEC dictatorships, enriching OPEC dictatorships at the cost of Alberta workers. That was the effective result of the surreptitious decision of the Government of Canada under Prime Minister Trudeau to kill the Energy East project. And then, of course, Mr. Speaker, we saw from our friends in British Columbia years of lawfare, harassment, political and otherwise, of the proposed Trans-Canada, the proposed pipeline from Edmonton to Burnaby, and at that time associated with Kinder Morgan. And of course, we saw the introduction of Bill C-48, the so-called tanker ban, which is a first in Canadian history. It identified a product that is really only produced in one province, Alberta, that is bitumen, and said it cannot be exported off the northwest coast of Canada. Let me pause there just to point out the irony, Mr. Speaker. The Port of Vancouver exports more coal than any port in North America. In fact, it exports coal produced in the United States. It exports not just metallurgical coal, but high-emitting thermal coal to fuel coal-fired power plants that are being built in Asia. And the same federal government, and that's being exported from a federally owned port. And the federal government that actually makes money off of that through tolls out of that port tells us that a private company cannot spend billions of dollars creating jobs disproportionately for First Nations people to go to the West Coast in partnerships with First Nations to export Alberta energy. That was the effect of C-48, which, following the rejection of Northern Gateway, effectively slammed the door shut on any potential future efforts to create a Northwest Coast bitumen pipeline. Mr. Speaker, and then, insult to injury, Bill C-69. What we in Alberta call the No More Pipelines Law, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, which turns the Constitution on its head by granting to the federal government effectively unlimited powers over environmental assessment and regulation, even in areas that are clearly and exclusively within our jurisdiction, such as the development and regulation of our natural resources. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is such a flagrant violation of our constitutional prerogatives that we have kept our commitment to Albertans by challenging its constitutionality through a judicial reference to the Alberta Court of Appeal. Mr. Speaker, as I said yesterday in debate on the motion to ratify the election of Alberta Senate nominees, the Senate of Canada, the majority of whose members were appointed by Justin Trudeau, a Senate that has only 6 Alberta representatives, voted to empty Bill C-48, basically to delete the bill because they saw it as being so prejudicial and so damaging to national unity and national prosperity. Remarkable. It went back to the House of Commons, and what did Prime Minister Trudeau do? Repopulated the bill and shoved it down the throat of the Senate and of Albertans and of the First Nations who object to it, who were never consulted on it. Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines Law. Again, the Senate of Canada accepted and adopted virtually every substantive amendment proposed by the Government of Alberta and the Canadian oil and gas industry. To me, that's remarkable. We had senators from every province in the country understanding the damaging effect of that bill to national unity and national prosperity, and yet the man entrusted with being the ultimate custodian of national unity, the Prime Minister, disregarded the advice that he received from his own appointees in the upper chamber and dismissed completely the concerns, the profound concerns of the people in the government of Alberta. Well, at that time, I can't say the government of Alberta was profoundly concerned, but certainly the people of Alberta. And so, Mr. Speaker, I say that because the NDP, of course, was in cahoots with the federal government on Bill C-69. Mr. Speaker, these are measures that were being taken in the midst of a prolonged recession in this province, for the province that has been the moneymaker, the bill payer for the Federation. Now, let me add, Mr. Speaker, that the constructive role we have played in the economic history of modern Canada is not limited to fiscal transfers through the complex system of fiscal federalism. Although that $630 billion is important, it has helped to pave roads in New Brunswick, to build hospitals in Newfoundland, to subsidize daycare rates in Quebec and tuition rates in Quebec and corporate tax rates in Quebec. It has helped to subsidize, by the way, public services through equalization in those provinces that have refused to develop their natural resources, that have put a ban on oil and gas development, and that have frustrated pipeline projects. In fact, the province of Quebec, pour lequel j'ai énormément de respect, évidemment, Monsieur le Président. Le moment que je suis élu comme Premier ministre de l'Alberta, j'ai parlé pendant plusieurs minutes aux Québécois et Québécoises de l'importance de l'alliance historique entre l'Alberta et le Québec. Et j'ai lancé un appel pour être les partenaires dans la prospérité. Et j'ai établi une relation productive, je dirais, et respectueuse avec le Premier ministre du Québec, François Legault. Et nous admirons les Québécois et les manières dans lesquelles ils ont lutté pour leurs intérêts dans la Fédération canadienne. Mais cela étant dit, Monsieur le Président, ce n'est pas acceptable pour les Albertains que le gouvernement du Québec profite de richesses des Albertains et le travail des Albertains quand il bloque effectivement l'exportation de l'énergie de l'Alberta qui produit ces richesses. I'll translate, Mr. Speaker. While we love and respect our Quebec friends, in fact, Mr. Speaker, on the night this government was elected, I spoke publicly for several minutes in French to Quebecers saying how much we respect them, and we want to be partners in prosperity with them. And we admire the way in which Quebecers have fought so diligently for their own interests in this federation. And we want to renew the historic alliance between Quebec and Alberta. While all of those things are true, and while I've established a respectful relationship with Premier Legault, it is not acceptable for that government to play a de facto veto over pipelines that would help us to produce the wealth that effectively we transfer to Quebec from which they benefit. And so, Mr. Speaker, with all of that as context, with all of that and more as context, Albertans have said very simply, we want to continue through the Federation to share our good fortune. We acknowledge that we have a higher per capita average income. And we acknowledge that's one of the reasons we pay a higher relative level of federal taxation. And we are grateful that we have the natural resources and the ingenuity and work ethic to generate that wealth. But, Mr. Speaker, where we draw a line in the sand is when other governments go out of their way to frustrate the development of those resources and the exercise of that ingenuity and work ethic. That is where we say, enough is enough. Albertans cannot be expected to continue to pay the freight if other governments in Canada will not allow us to develop the economy that pays those bills. So that is the context which has led to this resolution, to this proposed constitutional amendment, to this referendum that was held on October the 18th. I note many commentators have typically dismissive of the decision that Albertans made, that they didn't know what they're voting on, like Albertans aren't smart enough, Mr. Speaker, to understand these issues. How condescending. How typical of some of the Laurentian elites, but we heard it from the NDP. We heard it from the bien-pensant commentariat here in Alberta. That, these people they don't really understand any of these issues. I'm trying to use parliamentary language here, Mr. Speaker, but that is incredibly insulting. Then they said, oh, well, there wasn't sufficient turnout on this. 62%, Mr. Speaker, on a municipal election, 62% in favour on a municipal election. Now, oddly enough, the media reported the election of the mayor of Calgary as a historical landslide. The yes side on this referendum received more votes than that mayoral candidate did on the same day. So let's put aside all of these spurious objections, Mr. Speaker. And then they say, well, this is just entirely symbolic and it has no effect and the province can't initiate this amendment. But, Mr. Speaker, I invite those critics to actually read the Quebec secession reference of the Supreme Court of Canada from 1998, which effectively said that if a province holds a referendum on a proposed constitutional amendment with a clear question and a clear majority votes in favour, the Government of Canada has a binding obligation to negotiate that proposed amendment, quotes, in good faith, unquote. Now, some have said, well, that's a misreading of the Quebec secession reference because it was in the context of specifically a referendum on secession. Now, I believe that's a disputable point. But even if we accept the merit of that argument, there is zero doubt that this legislature can initiate a constitutional amendment process through the adoption of a resolution to that effect, and that is exactly what we are debating in this House right now. So, Mr. Speaker, for skeptics or people who are confused about this, I would refer them to a thoughtful paper written by Professor Emeritus Rainer Knopf, Professor Emeritus at the University of Calgary for the Fraser Institute, which walks through all of the relevant jurisprudence in this regard. And so this motion is before us, in a sense, for greater certainty. For greater certainty. We believe that the referendum held under the laws of Alberta, a free and fair referendum with a clear question and a clear majority voting in favour, is sufficient to trigger the process of a constitutional amendment. But for greater clarity, we have given members of this place the opportunity to adopt this resolution formally and undoubtedly to initiate the process. So what is it that we are seeking from this amendment, Mr. Speaker? Well, as I've said, I don't think Albertans object to sharing wealth across the country within reason. Within reason. But the facts that I have just laid out are unreasonable. And so fundamentally what we are seeking in initiating this amendment is the opening of a dialogue, a formal dialogue, with a formal negotiation with the Government of Canada over our role in the Federation and our demands for basic fairness, starting with basic fiscal fairness. To give you a very simple example, Mr. Speaker, why did the federal government not provide our full entitlement or allotment under the Fiscal Stabilization Program? To explain, that was a program established in the 1970s to provide some fiscal stabilization for provinces, typically have provinces, which have faced a sudden collapse in their revenues, as we did in 2015 and then again in 2020. But an arbitrary cap has been imposed. A per capita cap has been imposed on that program, meaning that Alberta received, I think, $230 million in fiscal stabilization payments, when in fact we've been entitled to $5.4 billion in FSB payments. Now, there was some half measure to address this in this year's federal budget, but only to do so prospectively. And so we are still out several $billion, despite the $20 billion that we continue to contribute annually to the rest of the Federation net. Mr. Speaker, at the same time, just to put this in context about how we are treated in the Federation, you know, you would think of federations like a family where the parents try to treat all of the kids equally, not to suggest that there should be a paternal relationship, but what I can tell you is there's not even an effort by the current government of Canada to demonstrate equity amongst the provinces. Because 3 months ago, our friends in Newfoundland and Labrador, for whom we have great affection and respect, received a commitment from the federal government for over $5 billion in cash to help them pay down the debt incurred by the Muskrat Falls Hydro Dam project. Now, Newfoundland and Labrador are in fiscal crisis, and I don't begrudge them support, and they overextended themselves. The previous government did on that project. But, Mr. Speaker, it's a province of 650,000 people. And they had been hit as hard as well by the energy price collapse in 2015, 2020. But, Mr. Speaker, $5 billion by fiat, by the federal government, to address deep and legitimate challenges in our fellow province, and effectively zero for Alberta. How is this basic equity? How does it help national unity when provinces are treated with such clear double standards? Mr. Speaker, that is the kind of fiscal issue that we need to raise. We also need, of course, in the context of these negotiations, to raise the equalization formula itself, which allows for an automatic annual escalator in payments, which means the payout goes up regardless of what happens in the economy or any given province year after year after year. And where does most of the revenue for those payments come from? From Alberta taxpayers. Which is why Quebec has seen in recent years its total equalization transfer move from $8 to $13 billion, even at a time that they are exercising a political veto on pipelines and refusing to develop their natural gas. And that's another area where we need to pursue reform, Mr. Speaker, which is the inclusion of, the exclusion of natural resource revenue, royalties and revenues, from the calculation of fiscal capacity within the equalization formula. Because what the formula currently does, Mr. Speaker, is to effectively punish provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan that develop our resources, because the revenue we generate from that is included in the estimate of our fiscal capacity. But provinces like Quebec that have banned analogous resource development, they are choosing not to increase their fiscal capacity. Mr. Speaker, this is a perverse incentive for provinces not to develop Canada's natural resources, and it's fundamentally unfair. So there are many aspects of the equalization system itself which need to be reformed. But more broadly, Mr. Speaker, what we seek is a way forward for this province in the Federation. What we seek specifically are fundamental amendments to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, Bill C-69, the repeal of the tanker ban, Bill C-48, and in the context of the Prime Minister's comments this week in Glasgow, we demand that the federal government cease and desist from making these threats of arbitrary action to limit the development of the resources that belong exclusively to Albertans.
That's right.
So, Mr. Speaker, I note that the House must shortly adjourn to attend Remembrance Day ceremonies. Let me close then on this note by saying that in a few minutes we will gather to remember the sacrifices of Albertans and Canadians who fought for this great country. Albertans, I believe the overwhelming majority of Albertans maintain their fidelity to this country. They demonstrate it every single day. What they are asking for in this proposed amendment in the referendum of 2 weeks ago is very simple, Mr. Speaker. What they're asking for is respect. Respect for the role that we have played in building modern Canada. Respect for the $630 billion in net transfers. Respect for having been the great engine of job creation. Respect for the role that we have played in welcoming unemployed workers from the factories of Ontario, from the fisheries of Newfoundland, from the forests of British Columbia, to move from poverty to prosperity in this province. Respect for everything that we have done for Canada. We are simply asking for a sense of equity, respect, and fairness. And with the adoption of this resolution, we will be sending a powerful message to Ottawa demanding that respect and fairness, and we will not relent until we win it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.